Leviticus is kind of a problem, isn't it? First of all, Leviticus is boring. We'll just get it out there on the table, the thing all of us know already. It is the graveyard of millions of well-intentioned read-through-the-Bible plans. It's tedious. There are details and repetitive portions about rituals and sacrifices and cleanliness codes. And there are times when it feels like you're reading a cookbook or an assembly instructions for a bookshelf or something like that, not exactly a page-turner. To make matters worse, Leviticus seems irrelevant. I believe it when Paul says in 2 Timothy that all Scripture is breathed out by God and useful, but Leviticus really stretches my notion of what useful means. Practical life application is not the first thing you think of when you read it. I've never offered a sacrifice. I never intend to offer a sacrifice. I'm not a priest. I've never had to determine which skin markings are clean or unclean, and I do clean my bathroom every once in a while, not as often as my wife would like, but I have never had to ritually purify my house from mildew. So Leviticus doesn't wear, relevance on its sleeve. Reading Leviticus isn't just like reading a cookbook. It's like reading a cookbook with food you'll never eat, never make, or never want to eat. And even if you did, you couldn't find the ingredients in order to make it. There's no priesthood, there's no tabernacle, there's no temple. So why do I need to know so much in so much detail about them? But probably the most significant challenge with Leviticus for modern readers is that at times Leviticus seems objectionable, morally objectionable. For many people, the notion of sacrifice is nonsensical at best, but at worst, it seems cruel and unusual. I was a table leader for a ministry called Alpha. Some of you are probably familiar with that. The idea behind Alpha is that you create a non-threatening space for people to explore the Christian faith, to talk about it, be open, honest about it. And one evening, there was a presentation about why Jesus had to die. And the presenter used four biblical images. He talked about the law court, he talked about the marketplace, he talked about the home, and then he talked about being cleansed by sacrifice in the temple. And when we were discussing this around the table, a man at my table says, I was really following him when he was talking about being acquitted in court and having your debt paid in the market and being reconciled at home. That all made a ton of sense to me. But then he started talking about sacrifice, and I completely lost him. It went totally backwards. I couldn't understand what killing an animal would have to do with my relationship with God. Why would God even care? Why would an innocent animal need to suffer like that? What's with all the blood? It seems so primitive and bloodthirsty. What's going on here? And for a lot of us, these are real issues. In an age where we're concerned with animal cruelty, it seems like senseless slaughter at times. There's kind of an ick factor in Leviticus. I mean, there's lots of discussion of fat and organs and entrails, and there's tons of blood. Blood gets smeared and splattered and sprinkled on everything, and it's really kind of gross for a lot of us. Perhaps you can relate to these challenges. You've probably read the book and thought the same things. It's tough. So the question is, how can we actually make sense out of the book of Leviticus? How can we see it as not boring or bizarre, but interesting and relevant? And more than that, how can we come to see Leviticus as good news? This morning, I'm just going to address one portion of the book of Leviticus, just the sacrifices. We've got to narrow it down. There's a lot going on in the book, but we're going to focus on the sacrificial system. And I want to address the issue of boredom first. I actually think that this is the easiest one to deal with in Leviticus. Part of the problem is because of the genre. It's procedural texts about rituals, and so there's a lot of detail about how things work. In our day and age, we would call these how-tos. And what's interesting when you realize that is you recognize there are lots of how-tos in our society, but they're written kind of different. Ours are mostly visual rather than written. Think of when you've assembled a bookshelf or a piece of furniture that you bought. There's probably illustrated instructions. Or if you make something from a cookbook, that's usually illustrated. Or, like most of us today, if you want to do something handy around the house and you don't know how to do it, what do? You look up a video online. So, in other words, if Leviticus were written today, Moses would have posted it on YouTube, okay? So that helps. It doesn't make it easy to read, but it gives you some patience with some of the parts that feel tedious or procedural because it puts it in a category you can kind of understand. I also think the ick factor, the blood factor, is easy to address too. I think that the primary reason that we read this and we find it kind of gross to talk about all the animal parts is because we live in a post-industrial society. For most of us, if we had lived 200 years ago in this country or in other cultures, even today, there would have been a limited range of options for us as far as jobs go, and most of us would have ended up being farmers. And what that would mean is that every time you ate meat, either you or someone you knew would have had to personally kill the animal, which means all of this discussion about parts and blood would actually be somewhat familiar to you. The only reason we're grossed out by it is because we think that meat comes in individual serving sizes, neatly wrapped in styrofoam and saran wrap, you know? There's very little blood, very little mess, and we can sort of hide that part of our society from ourselves. We actually eat more meat than most people would have in that day and are therefore responsible for more animal deaths than the average Israelite would have been. But we hide that from ourselves and we think it's gross when we actually talk about it. The other thing that helps us to understand this is that when the Bible mentions animals, the first thing we think of usually is something like pet, you know? But what they would have thought of is money. In an agrarian society, your animals are your livelihood. They're your assets. So you can measure a family's wealth by the size of their flocks and herds, which is why when you read the book of Genesis, there's so much discussion of the animals that the patriarchs had, because it was a sign of their growing prosperity. So when you hear about an animal, you should think about it first in economic terms, not in personal terms. These are finances, not Fido. I think keeping these things in mind helps clear away some of the initial barriers to sort of reading Leviticus. But I think the real way that understanding comes, where you get a depth of understanding, is when you start to see Leviticus as part of the entire Torah, when you put it in context of the story that's going on from Genesis to Deuteronomy and really beyond. Leviticus doesn't really do well standing on its own, and that's kind of why I wanted to do a series like this, so that we could see all of this in the grander context of what God was doing. Think about it. When we tell the story of the Exodus, we often end at the Ten Commandments. Think about the movie, The 10 Commandments. It's really anticlimactic. You get these dramatic scenes. You know, God speaks to Moses from the burning bush, and then Moses goes to Pharaoh, and he says, "Let my people go." And there's all sorts of dramatic plagues. There's blood, and there's flies, and there's gnats, and there's frog, and there's darkness, and there's hail, and there's death. And then finally, in one dramatic night, the people of Israel march out of Egypt, and there they are being chased down by an army, and they're pinned against the Red Sea, and God miraculously parts it. The people walk through, the army is crushed, and they meet God at the mountain, and Charlton Heston, comes down from the mountain, and what does he have? 10 rules. 10 rules, most of which were kind of obvious. If that's where the story ends, I'm not trying to minimize the Decalogue here, but if that's where the story ends, we kind of misunderstand it. In fact, those 10 words that God spoke on the mountain, as important as they are, were just the beginning. There was a lot of other stuff that God said to Moses up on the mountain. When you read the second half of Exodus, after the 10 Commandments, you realize, as was pointed out very well by Dr. Reichen last week, most of it is a description of how to build, and then the actual building of the tabernacle. And the climactic high point of the story is when God's presence fills the tabernacle, when his glory descends. That is the big moment there. As Dr. Wheaton pointed out a couple weeks ago, this is when Eden gets restored. The tabernacle is the central thing here. It's the thing that makes sense out of it. And when we see the tabernacle, it can seem a little bit odd that God would say, "I want you to build me a tent." But when you recognize that all of the people of Israel at that time would have been living in tents, it's a profound symbol, isn't it? For God to say, "I want you to build me a tent," means I'm going to move into the neighborhood. I'm going to pitch my tent right here in the middle of the camp with the rest of you. I am going to be with you. That's a really big deal, isn't it? If God's moving into the neighborhood's about to change. Imagine with me, let's say that rather than solving the government shutdown or the debt ceiling crisis, the Congress this week decides that they're going to vote to move the capital of the United States. They're going to pack up from Washington, and they're going to move to, let's use my town, Winfield, okay? Move over Central DuPage Hospital. Here comes the White House and the Capitol. Barack Obama is my new next door neighbor. Now, what happens to the little town of Winfield when that happens? Everything changes. There's an honor to being picked as the new center of government. There is a proximity to power and privilege that happens. And there's probably a more personal relationship with the government that goes on there. It changes a lot of things. A lot of really good things happen. But along with that also come some regulations and probably some restrictions. If the capital is moved, there's probably some rules about the kinds of buildings that can be built around it, or the kinds of businesses that can be opened near it. You have to deal with motorcades and security details. If you worked in one of these buildings, there would be things about the way you dressed, or what you could say, or how you could address a member of Congress or the president if they were in your presence. And there would be standards that would need to be met because of the privilege and the honor of having the seat of power be in your town. The book of Leviticus is essentially the outworking of that. It is saying when God moves into the neighborhood, when the King of Kings, the Lord of heaven and earth, comes into the neighborhood, these are the expectations, the lifestyle changes that come along with that great privilege. And of course, this is more than just an earthly leader here. This is God, the holy and righteous one. I want you to think about that for a second. If you're sitting in one of the chairs that has a glove, I'd like you to put the glove on. If you don't have a glove, you can go ahead and if there's one nearby, you can grab it. Think about what it would be like to suddenly be in the presence of God. This is what happens to Isaiah in Isaiah 6. This is what it says. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. And at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Imagine that, being there. What would come to mind? What would you feel? What would you do? What might you say? If you're on the end of a row with that had the gloves in it, I want you to grab the cup of coffee grounds that are underneath there. I want you to take your gloved hand, and I want you to dip your fingers in there. I want you to take a little bit, and I want you to start rubbing it in your gloved hand. The rest of you, if you just want to make a fist, that will get the idea here. Pass it along the row to the people next to you. This is what Isaiah says when he is in the presence of a holy God. He cries out, Woe is me, I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. This is the problem of a holy God dwelling with an unholy people. He is righteous, we are sinful. He is pure, and we are defiled. And when we recognize that, when we feel it and experience it, the only proper response is, Woe is me, I am ruined. As you rub that in your hands, I want you to ask the question, what would make me say, woe is me, if I suddenly found myself in the presence of God? What would make me feel ashamed before him? What would cause the guilt to rise up inside me? What would make me bow my head or cover my face or make me want to run and hide like Adam and Eve that first evening after the fall? The sacrificial system was meant to deal with this discrepancy of the presence of a holy God and the reality of people who are tainted by sin and mortality. One of the interesting things about the sacrifices is that when they're described in Leviticus, they're described in detail about how the sacrifices should be offered, but there's very little extended explanation of why they worked the way they did or how they functioned. The reason for this is, and it's very frustrating for us because the last thing we're interested in is how to do a sacrifice, but we really would like to know why they were done, what they mean. But the reason for this is that in the culture that this was written, sacrifices would have been self-evident. The logic of them could be implicit because it was understood. Think about it. When was the last time that someone had to explain to you why we shoot off fireworks on the 4th of July? Or why we might put flowers on someone's grave or blow out candles on a birthday cake? Or why we wear gowns and mortar boards at a graduation? I'm sure there are good reasons for these things, but they're normal enough in our society that we don't actually have to reflect on them or explain them all that often. For us, sacrifices make very little sense, but for many cultures throughout history, and especially in the ancient Near East, the logic of sacrifice was obvious. It had its own logic. It didn't need much explanation. Sacrifices were the way everyone related to their gods. And I think that's important to remember because when God relates to his people, he meets them where they're at, even if he wants to take them to another place. When God interacts with us, he both enters into our culture fully, but also transforms it as he does. He uses our forms of communication to interact with us. And yet, the logic behind the sacrifices in Israel wasn't completely adopted from the surrounding cultures. And some very important ways, Israel's sacrificial system was dramatically different from the surrounding cultures. God adopted the cultures around Israel, but at the same time, he subverted them. Here's how people in the ancient Near East would have thought about sacrifices and offerings. They considered their gods to be something like large-sized versions of humans. It's more detailed than that, but they might have extraordinary power or knowledge, but in many ways, they were big people with big needs. And those needs weren't very different from human needs. They needed food and clothing and drink and entertainment, admiration, rest and relaxation, even sex. And the reason that human beings were created was to make sure that the gods had all of those needs met. But the tricky part was that people didn't always know what a particular god needed at a particular time. They just knew that their gods got angry sometimes. And it was obvious when that happened because their crops would die or their enemies would defeat them or there'd be a flood or something bad would happen. When the gods got cranky, things went wrong. Problem was, you didn't always know why they were cranky. They're a lot like fussy newborns. It's sort of like, why are they crying? I don't know, stick a bottle in its face. Did that work? No, well, try burping it. Okay, we'll do that. Did you check its diaper? It's that sort of thing, this guesswork. So people developed all of these rules and rituals to keep the gods content. They'd offer them food and drink. They would make sure the noise level around the temple was low enough that they could sleep and rest. And they'd bring a god to his consort so they could spend an evening together. They'd throw a party in honor of their achievements. They do a lot of different things to try to somehow get the gods to play nice and settle down. This is what is so dramatically different about Israel's sacrificial system. First of all, Israel knew exactly what God wanted. There was no need to guess. They never had to live in uncertainty about whether God was pleased or angry with them. And the fact that the book of Leviticus opens with the line, "The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting and said, 'Speak to Israel," is a dramatic act of grace. It was God communicating clearly with his people who he was, what he expected, and exactly what to do when those expectations were violated. They never had to wonder what God was thinking. Secondly, the sacrificial system was different than the surrounding cultures because God didn't actually need the sacrifices. This is mentioned throughout the entire Old Testament. Psalm 50 says it very clearly. "I don't need bulls from your barns or goats from your pens, for all the animals of the forest are mine. I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird on the mountains, and all the animals of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for all the world is mine and everything in it. Do I eat the meat of bulls? Do I drink the blood of goats?" The answer is no. God doesn't need to be fed. He's not hungry. He's not like the weak, cranky, dependent deities that Israel's neighbors were enslaved to. He's the living God. He's the owner of all things. He doesn't need anything. Human beings don't offer anything to him that isn't already his. We don't contribute something new to what God has. But then why the sacrifices? Why the offerings? What's the point? I have a friend who was a third grade teacher for a number of years, and every day she would send out her students to go play at recess, and she would stay in her room and she'd do some work there, or maybe eat her lunch. And every day after the students would come back from recess, on the warm days, they would come back with a handful of dandelions. And they'd say, "Mrs. T, I picked you some flowers." And she'd say, "Oh, thank you so much." And what she'd do is she'd take the already wilting dandelions and she'd put them in a cup on her desk and she'd prominently display them at the end of her desk. Then at the end of the day, she would throw out the dandelions, she'd fill the cup up with water, and she'd put it back out there because she knew that her students would come and bring those dandelions to her again. Now, did my friend need the dandelions? No. Were the dandelions inherently valuable to her? No. Did she want the dandelions? Kinda. What she wanted was a relationship with her students. She wanted to give them a way to let them know that she was open to them, that she cared about them, that she appreciated them. She wanted to give them a way to express their affection for her in return. And this was a way that was accessible to her kids. Now, she would have probably enjoyed roses better than dandelions or chocolates or a gift card to Starbucks, but for her students, this is something that they could bring, and it made sense to them. I think at some level, the sacrifices were the same with God. In the ancient Near Eastern context, sacrifices are an accessible way of expressing your relationship with the deity. They're ways of expressing thankfulness and loyalty, remorse and reverence, honor and love. Did God need them? No. Did God value them? Absolutely, because they were vehicles of relationship. Hosea 6:6 says, "I want you to show love, not offer sacrifices. I want you to know me more than I want burnt offerings." God values the relationship expressed in the sacrifices, not simply the sacrifices themselves. Of course, the sacrifices weren't completely arbitrary. They communicated very important things. There were ways that they were set up to communicate certain things and not other things. And ultimately, they were to foreshadow the sacrifice of Christ, which was a very important thing. But they were highly contextualized expressions of worship. And they made the most sense in the culture in which they were given. So the question is, for us, what exactly did the sacrifices symbolize? What did they communicate for someone in that culture? And there isn't a simple, direct answer to this question, mostly because there's lots of different kinds of sacrifices in Leviticus. But taken as a whole, there's kind of a set of overlapping ideas I see expressed in the sacrifices in Leviticus. Primarily, sacrifices express the idea of cleansing. They were a means of cleansing the sacred space where God interacted with his people, the objects that were used in worship, and even the worshipers themselves. This idea of clean and unclean is a little strange for us. It's not used in our culture very much. And the idea of defilement is a little foreign to us. But in a lot of cultures, the categories of clean and unclean are as central as the notions of guilt or innocence. They were ways of organizing society and making sense of life. And the sacrifices in Israel were a kind of ritual disinfectant for impurity, both for the worshiper, the sacred space, and the implements of the tabernacle. But the sacrifices also communicated an idea of complete commitment. You burned an entire animal there on the altar, saying, I am completely and totally giving myself and my life over to God. There were expressions of thankfulness and trust. The idea of bringing your first fruits was a way of saying, these crops, these animals, they may be the first thing that I've got this year, but I know that these are from you, God, and everything that comes after it is also from you. So I thank you for what I already have, and I trust you for what's coming. It was thankfulness and trust. They expressed sincere repentance. It's easy to say sorry, but hard to show sorry. But the death of an animal shows that you recognize the seriousness of sin. And when you think of an animal as both your livelihood, your wealth, but also the thing that you depend on for your life, you recognize that sin is a matter of life and death. And so when you offer up an animal, it shows that you are truly sorry and you really understand what has gone on when you violated God's commandments. And then some sacrifices involved a shared meal. There was an eating of some of what was offered there in the sanctuary, there in the presence of God. And in most societies, who you eat with is a sense of what your social network is. It gives the lines between enemy and stranger and friend and makes it clear who your kin and who your allies are. And so in a sense, for the worshiper to eat in the presence of God was a way of saying, God and I are not enemies anymore. We are friends. We are allies. I belong to him. There's a relationship here. There's an act of reconciliation and loyalty. And so the meanings of the sacrifices are multifaceted. And frankly, the offerings and sacrifices really have a logic of their own. They're not easily translated into other images. They help, but you kind of have to immerse yourself in the strangeness of it to start to understand it on its own terms. For me, it's so helpful to keep this bigger picture in mind, though. This idea that there is a sacred space where God has come to dwell with his people. And to welcome his people in, they need to be cleansed, and this space needs to be made for people to encounter God. This is where the restoration of the garden happens, where God walks with his people, talks with his people, and has communion with them. So let's circle back to the issue of relevance. It's all well and good that Israel had access to God through the tabernacle and the sacrifices, but what about us? Of course, the connection comes through Jesus Christ. If it weren't for Jesus, Leviticus would for us still be irrelevant. But because of Jesus, Leviticus both becomes a window into the good news of the gospel, but Jesus also becomes a window into Leviticus. All throughout the New Testament, it's clear that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of the tabernacle. He is the place where heaven and earth meet. The message of the tabernacle is the message of Christmas. It is Emmanuel. God is with us. Jesus is also the high priest of the new covenant. He is the one who offers the ultimate sacrifice to cleanse us from sin and reconcile us to God. And he himself is the ultimate sacrifice. He is the fragrant aroma that pleases God when we cannot. It is by his sacrifice that we are cleansed to become a dwelling place for God by his Spirit. By him, by Jesus, we are cleansed to join him in his priestly work of worshiping the Father. By Jesus, we can offer our whole selves up as living sacrifices. The whole book of Hebrews is really a commentary on the sacrificial system in the priesthood. This is what Hebrews 10 says. God's will was for us to be made holy by the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ, once and for all time. Under the old covenant, the priest stands and ministers before the altar day after day, offering the same sacrifices again and again, which can never take away sins. But our high priest offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time. Then he sat down in the place of honor at God's right hand. Because of Jesus, we can have fellowship with God. We can enter into his presence boldly, without shame, without guilt, knowing that we are no longer God's enemies, but his servants, his friends, and even his allies. This is the good news according to Leviticus. God has revealed himself loud and clear. We don't have to guess what he wants. God has made a way for us to enter his presence. We are not in the dark. We are not alone. God is with us.